Interior can provide information about monuments or heritage care. Prior to 1989, the Ministry of the Interior was a colossus with tens of thousands of employees carrying out a wide range of activities, which can be divided into security and civil administration. This included, for example, prisons, fire protection, archives, management of flats, non-residential premises, and also the management and control of national committees. And it was through the national committees, as well as through participation in the preparation of normative and legislative amendments, that the Ministry of the Interior participated in the formation and practical functioning of the state heritage protection in Czechoslovakia. However, this activity has never been a priority for the ministry, and it has been sidelined from the attention of its leaders. In this presentation, I will focus on the second aspect of the ministry's activities, namely the management of security issues, which was the responsibility of the National Security Corps. The Czechoslovak Security Service between 1948 and 1989 was one of the main pillars of the communist regime, with which it was closely linked. Its approach to monuments therefore largely reflected the attitudes of the ruling party elite. This presentation is the first probe to show the possibilities offered by the materials from the provenance of the Ministry of the Interior and its subordinate units in exploring the issue of heritage conservation in former Czechoslovakia. We will therefore touch on several topics, always mentioning specific cases. After ensuring security on the territory of the liberated Czechoslovak Republic was one of the primary tasks of the Ministry of the Interior. To a large extent, it was also responsible for the preservation of property, including antiquities. After the end of the war in 1945, there was a period of mass theft or even looting of antiquities and monuments, especially in the abandoned border areas. The larger items seized in confiscated buildings were to be concentrated in collection rooms and in so-called national property warehouses under the supervision of the National Restoration Fund. Here, the valuable objects were to be selected by the representatives of the conservation authorities, and the others were to be sold off. Of course, some objects were lost in the process. In 1949, there was a reorganization of the state administration, and regional headquarters of the state security in České Budějovice, established in 1949, sent employees to the Orlík Castle, where the objects confiscated from the Schwarzenbergs were collected. The security agents took lots of furniture, carpets. They took away several trucks. So they took carpets, upholstery, and many other objects, furniture, paintings. When the National Cultural Commission saw these objects several years later, because of their value, historical value, the reply was that they were the former property of the bourgeois Schwarzenberg, which had been forfeited to the state, and it was in no way a monumental or historically valuable material. The commission persisted and eventually went as far as the Prime Minister's office, which ordered the valuable items to be returned. However, the vast majority of the items had already been devalued and damaged by intensive use. On the other hand, as part of the pacification of the borderlands, members of the National Security Corps were also involved in the confiscation of German property, carrying out searches in abandoned German houses, and informing the relevant conservation authorities of any valuable objects they found. In addition, officers were invited to search confiscated buildings and secure their furnishings, and dealt with cases of theft or break-ins in unoccupied confiscated properties. Large-scale theft of privately owned property continued to occur after the Communist Party took power in February 1948. It was the second wave, which was directed by state bodies. The State Security Service, for example, investigated employees of the State Office for Religious Affairs in charge of clearing out monasteries. After their forced closure in April 1950, during which not only irreversible destruction of monastery property, but also large-scale theft occurred. Here I'd like to mention the so-called K case. And this case and similar cases ended with impunity or minimal punishment by order of the political authorities. Paradoxically, the closure of the western borders and the strict control of society associated with the consolidation of the communist regime, played a major role in stabilizing the situation. The easing of the late 1950s and the gradual opening to the West then brought to the fore a new type of crime, which was the targeted theft of objects of heritage value. As early as 1959, the long-standing and extensive theft of collections of prints and drawings from the National Gallery itself was exposed. These were works collected by the National Cultural Commission under Zdeněk Wirth, which secured the property of Germans, traitors, and collaborators after the war. The looting, carried out by staff, including managers, was made possible by a combination of inadequate records of objects, poor security, and a lack of control. Several thousand works were involved, mostly prints and drawings, including works by Max Schwabinski, Albrecht Dürer, Lukas Kranach, Rembrandt van Rijn, Cyril Boda, and others. In an attempt to cover up criminal activity, some of the original works were replaced by replicas. A number of works were then even sold back to the gallery by dealers through various roundabouts for a very high price. Even the highest party leaders showed interest in the case. In the early 1960s, this problem grew, and many small relics ended up in antique shops or abroad. Thieves targeted mainly religious buildings such as churches, chapels, but also museums and galleries that were practically unprotected against theft. In 1964, for example, members of the Public Security Service broke up an organized group of 6 people that operated in a wide area, and the group specialized in wood carvings. The Czechoslovak security services were faced with a new, unusual task, namely the search for perpetrators of theft of objects of historical value. The problem was so serious that it was reflected in the film production of the time. Even the biggest criminal aces of the television screen at the time dealt with the theft of monuments. For example, Commissioner Exner in The Treasure of the Byzantine Merchant, or in the series about Major Zeman, the issue was reflected in 2 episodes, The Way of the Cross and The Lady with the Coat of Arms. A specific feature was the targeted discovery of monuments hidden in the area of the former Sudetenland, hidden by their owners during the displacement after the end of the Second World War. A number of such hiding places were found immediately after the war. The most famous and best documented case is undoubtedly the discovery of the Romanesque reliquary of St. Maurice under the floor of the castle chapel of the Visitation of the Virgin Mary at Bečov nad Teplou Castle in 1985. However, this was not an isolated case. Already in 1955, valuable objects hidden by Jan Lariš Mönich, whose property was confiscated on the basis of the Beneš decrees, were found by the state security in the beehive and under the floor of the stable in the castle in Váč u Podbořan. These included silver and gold utensils, cutlery, coins, as well as 28 boxes of old books. For me personally, it was a surprise that the state security did not focus on accessible monuments as places of concentration of tourists from capitalist countries. The focus of interest remained on accommodation premises, where secret collaborators were recruited or where operational equipment, especially listening devices, were installed.
Je využití památkově chráněných a významných budov
Another point of contact where security forces and monuments meet is the use of historically important and protected buildings or components of the Czechoslovak security forces. Although the use of listed buildings is associated, especially in the western border area, to a much greater extent with the Czechoslovak security forces, the army, and units of the border guard, many of these buildings were also used by units subordinate to the Ministry of the Interior. Particularly in the early days and during the consolidation of the communist regime in the early 1950s, a number of buildings of historical value were occupied by the rapidly expanding security apparatus. For example, the Benedictine monastery Svatý Jan pod Skalou or the castles of Ořechov or Vinoš were used by the National Security Corps schools. The Capuchin monastery in Marianská near Jáchymov was part of a forced labor camp for uranium ore mining in the 50s. A secret security forces prison was set up at the castle in Koloděje, in which a number of political prisoners were detained. Before 1989, the Ministry of the Interior was responsible for archival care, management, and the heritage buildings of castles and monasteries were often used as archive headquarters or depositories. For example, the Broumov Monastery, the Adržbach, Mníšek pod Brdy, Jezerní Vtelno, Zámrsk Castle, where the State Regional Archive is still located. A specific group was represented by the so-called monitoring points, equipped with cameras set up at some important monuments in Prague. So these were monitoring Western tourists or other persons of interest. These were placed, for example, at the Šítkov water tower near the building of the Mánes Association House or the bell tower of the St. Nicholas Church in the Leicester town. As an example, let's mention two monuments in the historical center of Prague. Both were used by the surveillance administration from the 1950s until the fall of the communist regime. These were the Trautmannsdorf Palace in Loretánská Street in Hradčany near Prague Castle and the Benedictine Monastery in Markétská Street in Břevnov. The code names of the buildings, Loreta and Markéta, were chosen accordingly. These were relatively inconspicuous buildings located close to Western embassies, allowing for the control of diplomats and citizens of Western countries. The services located there were to be strictly secret, and their presence was to be kept secret. So, for example, the Břevnov Monastery was the official seat of the Assembly Institute, for which letterheads and stamps were even produced, and a special secretariat was set up. Both buildings were recognized as cultural monuments in December 1964. Both were intensively used, but investment in the buildings was minimal, and instead of repairs, only modifications were made to make the buildings as suitable as possible for the needs of the Ministry of the Interior. So, for example, lifts, elevators were installed, or electric installations. The state of these buildings was very bad. Not surprisingly, the Trautmannsdorf Palace was in a disastrous state at the turn of the 1970s and 80s. The exterior facades were in need of repair, but also the interior, windows, doors, etc. Even repairs were basically limited to the most necessary interventions, such as the repair of the wiring in the mid-80s. The archives stored here were threatened by humidity, wide fluctuations in temperature depending on the seasons, and the presence of mice. Similarly, the Břevnov Monastery housed part of the economic background of the surveillance unit and the entire first department, which provided security for diplomats of Western embassies. The latter used only a small part of the outbuildings. It was almost 300 people and 120 cars. The situation here was complicated by the fact that, in addition to the dilapidated state of the buildings, most of the building was used by tourists and the church began to seek the return of the monastery to its ownership in the late 1980s. At that time, the presence of the Ministry of the Interior in the building was even discussed in the newspapers. However, the ministry firmly refused to return the monastery to the church. As far as modifications to the exterior of the buildings were concerned, the Ministry of the Interior ensured that standard procedures were followed and negotiated with the relevant conservation authorities. But for interior modifications, the conservation authorities were not consulted, which became apparent when the Trautmannsdorf Palace was being modified into a modern computer-equipped connection center or computing center. From the foregoing, it can be concluded that the materials generated by the activities of the security forces subordinate to the Ministry of the Interior and stored today mainly in the archive of the security forces are only peripherally relevant to heritage care in the form of individual specific cases. On the other hand, we can find information confirming and specifying data on the development of heritage protection in the years 1945 to 89, and in some cases, data on specific buildings or small monuments, including plans or even photographs. For example, the photographs of the Orthodox Church of St. Michael at the Kinsky Garden in Prague, which burned down in 2020 and is being rebuilt, and whose photographs are included in a magazine published by the Surveillance Administration, are a recent example. The reports on monuments are some kind of side effect of the activities of the security forces, but then they can provide interesting information still today. Thank you for your attention, and I hand over back to the moderator.
Také já jsem pouze moderátor, nikoli hlavní.
Thank you. I'm not a speaker today, I'm merely a moderator. It's you who are the speakers this morning. Anyway, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you also for respecting the time span for your talk. There will be some time for Q&As, but that will be at the end of this morning session. We will first hear all the contributions. Of course, also our audience can put forward their questions and comments. You can do so in the chat boxes on both YouTube channel, that is to say on the English and Czech channel. I will then read the questions and comments to our speakers. So please feel free to add your comments and questions. And in the meantime, I will give the floor to our next speaker, Martin Gaži. Martin Gaži studied on the South Bohemia University in Czech Budějovice, and he specializes in social conditions of sacral buildings and microhistory of 17th and 18th and 19th century. He also specializes in the literary history of 19th and 20th century, and he concentrates also on the history of memory and heritage care in the 20th century. He works with the National Heritage Care Institute, and he is also editor of numerous monographies, as well as editor of the magazine on monuments in southern Bohemia. Today we will hear his presentation on the Vltava Cascade and heritage management in the southern Bohemia. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. I will try to share my presentation.
Není mnoho radikálnějších a méně vratných zásahů.
There are only few more radical and less reversible interventions in the cultural landscape than building dams in historically inhabited areas. The vision of the Vltava Cascade of dams has been gradually crystallizing since the end of the 19th century. It accelerated in the thinking of the technocratic intellectuals during the 1940s. At that time, the planning euphoria towards the radical exploitation of natural resources affected both East and West. In pre-1948 Czechoslovakia, for example, the Tennessee River hydroelectric cascade found an enthusiastic response. Thereafter, only the gigantic Soviet dam projects were the subject of propaganda. Maximized hydroelectric structures with an energy purpose were presented to the domestic and international public in both Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia as proof of the efficiency of the new social order. The presentation of the Orlík turbine at the 1958 Expo was a case in point. You can see the Czech pavilion from the Expo 58 on the picture. Specific plan for the construction of the Vltava Cascade of dams was approved by Czechoslovak government in the early 1950s. By 1965, the energy-oriented hydroelectric projects were to transform almost the entire course of the river. Here you can see the plans of the cascade. Also, the plans were soon significantly delayed. Some of them were realized at enormous financial cost. In 1951, it was the construction of Slapy Dam, then the dams of Lipno 1 and Lipno 2 in 1952. Then in 1954, the works on Orlík Dam began, and then later works on Kamík Dam in 1956. The other planned dams remained in prospect for the following years. The pressure of power gave almost no room for public discussion of the loss of cultural heritage in the flooded areas during the period of Czechoslovak Stalinism and early Khrushchevism. A hint of change came shortly after the mid-1950s, when a working group for scientific research and technical security of monuments was attached to the Academic Commission on Water Management, headed by the influential Prague academic Zdeněk Virt, that we have heard of already today and in the previous days of this conference. A more significant turn in favor of state interest in the brutally devastated heritage stock was about to take place in 1958, shortly after the publication of the groundbreaking Act number 22 on cultural monuments. And the methodological instructions which were sent to preservation workers in the regions in January 1959, its provisions were interpreted very boldly by Jakub Pavel, deputy director of the Prague State Institute for Monument Protection, who questioned, and I quote, "the great works of planning destroying the cultural landscape. We know from experience that the planned economic values did not come to the expected extent, and that the result of the whirlwind of millions that was sometimes unleashed was only cultural damage." No one actually dared to speak this so radically to the publicly available media at that time. The formulation of the contradictions between economic demands and the protection of cultural values was echoed internationally at the time. However, there was still a general belief that they would be resolved by the rapidly developing scientific knowledge. This was also the spirit of UNESCO's global campaign, in particular the greatest action to save monuments ever undertaken by mankind, that is a quote from official materials, at the site of the Great Aswan Dam on the Egyptian Nile. And Czechoslovak specialists also took part in this project. In connection with the Orlík Dam, the first interest shown by central authorities was in two high-value castle complexes, castles of Orlik and Zvíkov. It was necessary to statically secure their bedrock, which was mainly a technological task. It was carried out by a centrally organized interdisciplinary group led by Professor Bedřich Hacar and his pupil Zdeněk Budinka, probably the most important personalities of the technological concept of post-war conservation. The instability of the partially weathered materials of the castle's bedrock necessitated a rapid testing of new technologies. Subsequently, the, I quote, achievements of our leading experts were presented to the public. However, 10 months after the hydroelectric power station was put into operation, it was already clear that the obligatory optimism would have to be tamed. A working group consisting of staff from Prague State Institute for Historical Preservation, the České Budějovice Regional Center, the district conservator, and relevant officials met on site in October 1962 and noted the terrible erosion of the stone blocks and masonry due to their constant contact with water. 2 years later, within a single day, cracks of up to 2 centimeters large appeared between the western retaining wall and the mass of the castle. To be sure, even these problems could eventually be at least partially satisfactorily addressed, but the chain of them inevitably led to doubt as to whether the system, which was loudly proclaimed as functional and efficient, was not just a desperate search for ad hoc ways to prevent the worst. The institutionalized system reacted at last minute, even in the case of archaeological rescue excavations. When Karel Polesný, a conservator from Pýcha and the director of the local grammar school, wrote to the Central Heritage Institution in May 1958, he could not conceal his astonishment that the renowned Prague experts were doing nothing, even 4 years after work on waterworks had begun. The excavations of the Zvíkov Lower Castle with the remains of the medieval Church of St. Nicholas, the medieval watchtower and river navigation station built by the Premonstratensians of Milevsko at Červená, or the massive early medieval Vystrkov Hradeň hill fortress were finally carried out under the enormous pressure of the approaching flooding. The Gothic church in Těchnice in central Bohemia and other monuments were silently sacrificed. The efforts to save at least some of what would soon disappear under the Orlik Dam culminated in the hasty dismantling of 1,100 steel elements of one of the first chain bridges in Central Europe, built between 1846 and 1848 near Podolsko. After many difficulties and misunderstandings, the bridge was finally rebuilt in Stadlec. However, the complete handover of the realistically socialist endless construction took place only in 1975. Even more spectacular was the rescue of the Romanesque Gothic Church of St. Bartholomew in Červená nad Vltavou. The first expression of serious interest in its relocation can be dated to 20th of June 1958, 7 years after the start of preparatory work on the hydraulic structures. On the orders of academician Zdeněk Virt, several Prague specialists led by Bedřich Hacar met at the site and recommended a new location for the church. However, this exhausted the activity of the central institutions, and it was not until November of the same year that the soldier in field, as to say, Josef Kytka, the district conservator of Milevsko, was able to set things in motion again. However, his initiative was strongly condemned by the leadership of the Milevsko District National Committee. A broader committee consisting of representatives of several central and regional institutions involved did not meet on the site until the 5th of June 1959. The preservationists from the recently established regional center in České Budějovice did arrange for survey work, but when the famous Prague restorer Milada Zbíralová arrived at the site, the local priest did not allow her to carry out a more extensive survey. No one had communicated with the church that owned the building until then. Only tiny fragments of late medieval paintings were found as a result, and the regional political authorities in the district and regional national committees quickly took advantage of this and blocked the financing of the building's transfer. At the local level, the action was eventually saved by the preservationist Stanislav Vetter from České Budějovice, and at the central level by the activity of a group of experts from the Ministry of Energy and Water Management. The Prague specialists, however, perceived the regional political pressures only very marginally, and in the early 1960s they concentrated on the dispute over the technology of transferring the building. This dispute was fought at the time when it was far from clear whether the church would not remain under the lake surface after all. The planned flooding of the Orlík Valley was less than 7 months away when the Ministry of Energy and Water Management finally decided to transfer the church, and the Ministry of Education and Culture designated the transferred church for the needs of a museum exhibition, which would be a testimony to the socialist state positive attitude towards heritage. In July 1960, a group of restorers arrived at the partially demolished church building, and in a never-ending downpour, they removed fragments of medieval paintings and tried to dry them near baskets of burning coke, lent to them by the construction workers in an emergency. The transfers then ended up in a wooden crate in a damp back wing of a nearby inn, and after absurd delays, returned to the church only 4 years later. On 12th of December 1960, the church tower was removed, and shortly thereafter, construction of the church began on a new foundation, about 150 linear feet and 40 vertical feet from the original location, using individual original architectural elements and blocks of masonry. Hazar's original concept of transferring the entire structure of the 2 faces of the original masonry by means of reinforced blocks was apparently only partially successful in reality. Structurally, the nave and the chancel were roughly completed in April 1961. Work activity then ceased for a long time. Nevertheless, the project and the realization of the transfer of the church in Červená were celebrated at an exhibition on the occasion of the Second International Congress of Monument Architects and Technicians in Venice at the end of May 1964. The modernist trend in Europe heritage preservation was triumphant there, among other things, with the so-called Venice Charter that we have already mentioned. At the same time, the relocated building that had long belonged to no one was full of mold and was slowly becoming a ruin overgrown with bushes again. The construction of the giant hydroelectric dam also marked the face of the castle and the town of Koloděje nad Lužnicí, or the former bishops and until 1960 district town of Týn nad Vltavou. In the end, the best way to promote the interests of the monuments was in the case of the Baroque chateau with important medieval and Renaissance structure in Koloděje. This happened despite the fact that the regional political elites initially favored the interest of the local agriculture cooperative, which had occupied the farm buildings on the site, and its representatives sought to transfer the sum intended for the protection of the castle to the construction of new cooperative complex. The construction of the dike, the technology which was hotly debated, and the restoration of the castle facade were eventually pushed through by multilateral pressure from both Prague and České Budějovice preservationists and the Museum of Capital City of Prague. This success, however, was an isolated victory. In both Týn nad Vltavou and Koloděje, regional preservationists could only helplessly watch the demolition of dozens of valuable townhouses in the early 1960s. It is therefore worth recalling one defiant attempt by the České Budějovice Conservation Center. At the beginning of September 1959, the Department of Construction and Water Management of the Regional National Committee Council convened an advisory board to discuss the Týn nad Vltavou master plan. Marian Farka, the 28-year-old preservationist of the České Budějovice Center, became the most critical participant in the meeting. He consulted the whole matter with Jakub Pavel, the deputy director of the State Institute for Heritage Care in Prague, already known to us. He started from the assumption that there was no point in protesting against the nationally prioritized construction of the waterworks and the demolition of the floodplain, but he was highly critical of everything that went beyond this and multiplied the destructive effect of on the historic core of the town. In particular, he strongly objected to those parts of the project that concerned the road through the town that cut through the historic center without any barriers. He also formulated the demand for the protection of the remains of the local castle without taking into account the political and economic interests of the state investor who planned a massive hotel building for the site. While in the first case he failed with his arguments, in the second case he succeeded. The experience of the heated struggle to preserve at least part of the identity of the historic city, which was the first of his professional career, became the impetus for his further urban planning specialization, which he applied after 1960s at the Prague State Institute for Historic Preservation, and then later after 1968 at the Vienna Monuments Office, where he became head of the Historic Towns Documentation Department in 1975. Another huge damage to the monument fund was threatened by the planned, but fortunately never realized dam above Český Krumlov, which according to the plans from 1950s was to swallow up the town of Rožmberk. There was a long-term building closure in the town and no funds were allowed to be spent on repairs of local monuments. And that's why they fell down one by one. In 1964, when the regional conservationist Jan Kubíček desperately tried to save the demolished Baroque synagogue, he tried to argue for the possible creation of a multi-purpose hall for local residents or toilets for tourists. Nothing helped. Nowadays, on the site of the two-story synagogue, we find just small remains of masonry used for a shed. Moreover, the demolition was financed with money earmarked for heritage conservation, which the regional center objected to in correspondence with the ministry unsuccessfully. The most ambitious behavior of the water management experts occurred in 1966 and 1967, when they were politically led by the ambitious communist reformer Josef Smrkovský. Regional preservationists were not invited to the negotiations then. The only focus of the central heritage authorities at that time was the rescue of Rožmberk Castle, including the strengthening of its bedrock in the manner of Orlík and Zvíkov castles, as we've already seen. However, the increased water level of the Český Krumlov dam was also to flood the town of Rožmberk with its Gothic church, another Gothic church in Zátoň, and part of the medieval grounds of the Cistercian monastery of Vyšší Brod. The subsequent stages of the dams were to trap the castle ruins of Divčí Kámen on the island, and the area of the former Cistercian monastery Zlatá Koruna was to be enclosed on two sides by 10-meter-high dikes. The design work continued in this vein until the spring of 1971, and then it slowly stopped. However, the town of Rožmberk remained in a disastrous state until the early 1990s. You can see this state on the photos. You can see the photo to the right depicts an old town house in the Rožmberk just hours before it collapsed. What does this information show? In many cases, after 1958, cooperation or complementarity between central and regional institutions was beneficial to the heritage conservation. However, it is also necessary to take into account the differences in the two perspectives. Central heritage institutions have always been closer to technocratic problem-solving, to massive rescue campaigns, and to the loud presentation of the successful combination of the words of preservation and scientific and technical innovation. Regional conservationists, however, whether from the regional center or individual district conservators, have seen these things from a different perspective. At the time when distant experts were arguing over the details of technology or finer points or of the theoretical underpinning of preservation approaches, they were saving the monuments themselves and feverishly rallying arguments against regional political efforts to wipe the issues out of the table. Where the successful application of new technologies were heralded to the world from the center, they tended to see all that had been accidentally left out. The applause of the International Forum, which in Venice in 1964, for example, looked with interest at the slowly opening up world of preservation behind the Iron Curtain, only reached regional and local everyday life from afar. Yet it must be stressed that at least partial success was only achieved where central and regional preservationists were able to work together. And this is a lesson that we can take home for today as well. Thank you for your attention.
Moc děkujeme za zajímavý příspěvek.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, which reminded me of some of the topics I encountered when I was doing research in Most. Even though the topic is different in many aspects, but the flood destruction is a common theme. But maybe we can talk about this in the discussion, because now it's the time for the next presentation, whose author is our next speaker, Čeněk Pýcha. He studied not only history, but also new media. He is also a long-time researcher of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. He focuses on education. His dissertation project and other research focused on the use of memory studies, the relation between memory and space. I hope it's not too big an oversimplification. So, Čeněk, the floor is yours, and the presentation is entitled Privileged Memorials in the Landscape of Cultural Monument, mainly in 1960s and 1970s. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this introduction, and thanks to the previous speakers of the conference. I'm very much enjoying this conference, and I'm happy I can join in. My talk is a torso of my dissertation, which is the basis, so I will have to simplify. But I will be also speaking about torsos, so that's maybe symbolic. Let me share my presentation now. At the center of my interest in heritage conservation are the memorials that were officially protected sites of memory in the period 1948 to 89. These memorials formed an important part of the official narrative of the period and often carried the highest level of heritage protection. Today, these memorials often stand unnoticed in the landscape or even in city centers. What can these torsos of memory tell us today about socialist conservation, and what about our relationship to the past in general? These are the two questions I will try to answer in my presentation. In the first part, I'd like to follow up to the legislation section of the conference from yesterday. An important change for the nature of monument care in the conditions of socialist Czechoslovakia was the new Monuments Act, adopted in 1958 as number 22 national cultural monuments, which were defined as follows. I quote, monuments which form the most important part of the cultural wealth of the nation are declared by the government on the proposal of the Ministry of Education and Culture to be national cultural monuments. The first list of national cultural monuments for the Czech part of Czechoslovakia was published in 1962. This created a hierarchy of 33 most important monuments, only one of which was not a specific place or building. These were the Czech crown jewels. The list thus continued the tradition of monument conservation, which focused mainly on architecture. In the list, we would find castles, including this jewel, and forts or palaces. Institutions of the national revival were also protected as important buildings, like the National Museum and the National Theatre. However, the list also included places of more symbolic value, especially Mount Říp, although it is listed here together with the Rotunda of St. George, which was probably more the focus of conservation. Among the National Cultural Monuments in 1962, we find a single memorial in the classical sense, which is the field with a memorial to Přemysl Oráč in Stadice, which is also on the list for symbolic reasons. According to the traditional Alois Regal categorization, it would be a so-called deliberate monument. So, among the intentional monuments or deliberate monuments, we could also include the national monument at Vítkov, which was one of the most recent buildings among the national cultural monuments. Sites of memory, known as the scene of important events, are also among the National Cultural Monuments list. These are the battlefield on White Mountain, and then places associated with the then recent events of the Second World War, Lidice and Terezín. The so-called Duchcov viaduct, the site of the clash between the Workers' March and the Gendarmerie in 1931, which together with the People's House and the house at the Chestnut Tree form a special layer of monuments strongly associated with the workers' movement. These can also be considered a site of the event. The Duchcov viaduct heralds a type of monument that will later gain increasingly strong official support. The monument protection here concerns a non-significant building and a new monument. Heritage protection takes on a new dimension of protecting essentially present values. I will not speak in detail about the viaduct because I have spoken about it extensively on other occasions. So the monument protection here concerns a non-significant building and a new monument, and it takes on a new dimension of protecting essentially present values from the perspective of Alois Regal. It brings an emphasis on the present into conservation. This is not only from the perspective of the importance of monuments for the present, a perspective already taken into account by Regal and Dvořák, but also from the perspective of protecting the current interpretation of history and events from the recent past. Now let me move on to the list from 1978. The list of national cultural monuments was most radically expanded in 1968, when 32 monuments were added to the list. This addition has a different function at the declarative level than simply extending monument protection to a larger number of sites as the field's capabilities grow. We encounter a somewhat paradoxical phenomenon where some new national cultural monuments could not be declared earlier for the simple reason that they did not yet exist. In the expert press, the expansion of the number of monuments with the highest degree of protection is justified by the 30th anniversary of the 1948 coup d'etat, and it is clearly stated that, I quote, "The set of newly declared national cultural monuments represents the high ideological and political values of the most socially important monuments. It mainly complements the first part of the set of national cultural monuments, declared by the government of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic in 1962, in which the monuments of the revolutionary and workers' movements and the anti-fascist resistance were represented in disproportionate numbers. Thus, a new category of monuments is being added, to which, according to the discourse of the time, were not given due space. Such a shift with regard to research questions arouses our attention. It completes the process of putting memorials on the same level as traditional heritage objects or buildings. Among the new national cultural monuments in 1978, we find mainly memorials that corresponded to the contemporary interpretation of contemporary history. 10 monuments relate to the anti-fascist resistance and liberation struggles. 9 are connected with the revolutionary and workers' movement. The new monuments are thus related in character to the above-mentioned concept of the Duchcov viaduct, but the viaduct is missing. This is a traditional monument, traditional object of heritage care. In this case, I would use Laura Jane Smith's term. She's an Australian theoretician. She speaks about heritage discourse, and I would say that the discourse is used for other objectives than heritage protection. These are objectives, ideological objectives, interpretation of history. This term is related to post-colonial debates on the use of heritage care or heritage protection, heritage use in colonial era in Great Britain, for example. I'd like to mention some other monuments that were, or sites that were added in 1978. For example, this memorial to the Vltava strike from 1961. This is the sculpture, the so-called partisan Moravka from 1968. So in effect, this did not exist back in 1962. Ploština from 1975. This is a memorial created just 3 years before 1978. Now I'd like to move on to some theses. So it can be said that in the 1970s and 1980s, a revised idea of what can be considered a monument came into full effect, or rather, memorials bearing deliberate monumental value deserved much more attention. In addition to traditional monuments, the high status of monument protection was also given to places that symbolically informed about significant events, rather than preserving the concrete materiality of the past, as it is more or less authentically preserved by immovable cultural monuments, such as church buildings or tourist favorites, such as castles and chateaus. While conservation continued to care for art historical monuments, the line of monuments that had more symbolic value was strong primarily at the declarative level. At this point, we may be inclined to the view that heritage conservation has evolved in this direction globally, as the events of the 20th century have challenged institutions of memory to relate to recent historical events, especially those associated with the Second World War, and to preserve their memory or the memory of heroes or victims. So either it was a global direction or it was an anomaly. It seems to me that it's possible to connect these two interpretative approaches in a synthesis, where socialist heritage care has its own specificities. This synthesis is somewhat paradoxical. The originally utopian and future-oriented revolutionary vision of socialism has become, through its musealization, similarly preoccupied with the past as societies in Western Europe or the United States. But this had different consequences for the late socialist societies than in other settings. Thus, the move towards the memory of working class and revolutionary roots in the 70s and 80s in official discourse made room for visions of the future that were incompatible with the state socialist establishment. Let me move on to today's perspective. The 1990s saw a relatively rapid transformation of the list of the most important monuments and the breakdown of the aforementioned synergy between monuments in the traditional sense and memorials with deliberate conservation value. Most of the above-mentioned memorials lost their highest conservation status, and in some cases, the design of the memorials was modified. The often mentioned and discussed iconoclasm associated with the revolutionary atmosphere did not directly affect the monuments with the highest protection, but rather the national cultural monuments lost the highest level of protection, gradually decaying, retreating, and being forgotten. Sites of memory declared national cultural monuments in 1978, and from our present perspective, somewhat privileged then, are paradoxically very endangered today. What can memorials today refer to? On the one hand, they still carry their original level of information, including radical revolutionary quotes in some cases, as we can see, for example, on the example of the memorial to the Vltava strike, there's a quote by President Gottwald. So it's the Vltava strike. Memorials would still be able to tell the original stories of the struggles in Moravka, the strikes in Duchcov, etc. However, such narratives lack the context and cultural practices that would bring the sites of memory back into circulation. For example, in the textbooks. Nevertheless, we should not neglect these torsos in public space. For example, tracing the original semantic meanings of these monuments may still have educational value. And this is what we are striving for in some of our projects. Another period to which these memorials refer to is, of course, the time of their creation and the situation when the monuments and the events they represent were on a social pedestal. It's probably this temporal plane that the memorials convey most effectively today. There are torsos of memorials that do not make much sense in contemporary public space. From this perspective, we could say that in this way, memorials better capture the current state of memory. The scenes captured by memorials create a kind of visual reflection of the original narrative reduced to a figure or gesture. Materials decay and corrode, are the target of vandalism and other remediations. The temporality of these monuments refers to the past. Such a function of memorials is also essential. Orienting us in public space, it creates points that can lead to more fundamental questions. One of the few memorials that have been repaired is that statue, Night Crossing in Moravka. Of course, it may be a coincidence. Nevertheless, in comparison with other memorials, the statue seems to have the most civilized expression, even though it's a statue of a fight. It's not a combative gesture. The other statues of the memorial materialize a more explicitly militant socialist narrative and have a revolutionary temporality. Another of the memorials that finds resonance in public space is Ploština. Here, visitors are attracted by the architecture of the memorial and its current state, as an analysis of user photos on the social network Instagram shows. It is precisely the fact that memorials in public space visualize and materialize decay and oblivion that can make them attractive tourist destinations, perhaps more attractive in their essence than they were during the period of state socialism, when they represented authorized heritage discourse. Memorials from the socialist period are much more in keeping with contemporary temporality than some of the memorials that are the product of contemporary memory policy. These memorials refer to the fact that they were once on a pedestal and are no longer so. They bear the message of their own transformation and the traces of decay and forgetting that are now the popular way of relating to the past. This relates to practices like dark tourism or for example, the global tourism to Chernobyl and so on. So that's all from me today. Thank you for your attention.
Moc děkujeme za zajímavý vhled do téhle.
Thank you very much for your insight into this field of study. I'll be looking forward to the discussion. Also, thank you for respecting the time span of your contribution. It seems that we may very well have half an hour for the discussion. That would be great. Last but not least, let me introduce the last presentation of this section. The authors of this presentation are Vojtěch Kessler and Josef Šrámek. Josef Šrámek specializes on the history of the Austro-Prussian War, and he works with the Museum of Eastern Bohemia in Hradec, Králové. Vojtěch Kessler works with the Historical Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and he specializes in research of memory and history of 20th century. We will hear a contribution with a very interesting title today, The Legacy of One-Armed Centurion in the Shadow of the Red Star, Managing Funeral Heritage Properties from the Prussian-Austrian War in 1948 and 1989. And let me give the floor to Vojtěch Kessler. Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My colleague apologizes that he cannot be here with us today. We, in our contribution, concentrate on monuments that refer to a specific historical event. We would like to show how the relationship between society and the political climate to the event in question determines the possibilities, source, and especially the strategies of preservation of these monuments. The Prussian-Austrian War of 1866 and the monuments. This war is rather has a special place in the Czech historiography. On one hand, it is not an explicitly unknown and overlooked conflict. At least a few sentences mention this event in history textbooks. On the other hand, professional interest in the history of this war has always been limited to individuals, often very distant in terms of generations, so that there is no major generational, much less conceptual and methodological debate within the research of this topic. However, the situation emerges in a diametrically different way if we look at it through a local lens. It is perhaps with some surprise that we find that in the regions of the former battlefields of 1866, the war events in question are still alive, traditional, and reflected upon by wide and very diverse social circles. This is particularly true of the battlefield at Hradec Králové, the scene of the decisive battle, which, while being aware of all the differences, comes closest to what we might call, following Pierre Nora's example, a place of memory. There are several reasons for this. One of the main, perhaps even decisive, reason being the authentic wartime experience of broad sections of the society of the time, which was eventually petrified into a set of monuments or memorials, mostly war graves. In terms of its number and a certain continuity, the Hradec Králové battlefield of 1866 represents a certain uniqueness as a memorial commemoration zone, even in international comparison. The years 1948 to 1989 were crucial for this memorial zone, as we want to demonstrate in our presentation. In order to properly understand the context, we must briefly mention the overall development of memorial care in the battlefield. It began to take on the character of a memorial site soon after the war has subsided. The first set of memorials were created as early as 1866. However, during the following decades, the graves and monuments and memorials on the Hradec Králové battlefield began to logically succumb to the ravages of time, and by the end of the 1880s, their physical condition was already quite deplorable, which is also evidenced by a number of testimonies, including the local press of that time. This shows that the civil society of the time, in contrast to the official or state circles, perceived the situation as critical and did not intend to accept it. Thus, in 1888, a society was founded, which, under the name of the Committee for the Maintenance of Memorials on the Hradec Králové battlefield, undertook the purposeful care of funerary monuments from Prussian-Austrian War. The initiator of this idea and subsequently the first chairman of the society was a retired centurion Jan Nepomuk Stejnský, who himself took part in the war campaign in 1866 and suffered a severe wound in the Battle of Hradec Králové, as a result of which his arm had to be amputated, as you can see on his photograph. Stejnský thus possessed not only the intrinsic motivation, but also the personal story and, not least, the charisma needed to make the project a success. During the years of Stejnský's presidency, the association or the society succeeded not only in eliminating the danger of the disappearance of the war graves, but also in expanding this number, either by its own activity or by mediating initiatives. Through the memorials and war graves, the events of the summer of 1866 became a fixed part of the landscape of Hradec Králové, and thus hand in hand with the developing tourism also of social awareness. The outbreak of the First World War naturally caused a decline in the society's activities, and the social position of Hradec Králové committee also changed significantly after 1918 as a result of the establishment of the Czechoslovak Republic, and with it a radical change in the political and social atmosphere. The development of the memorial zone, measured in terms of memorial buildings, essentially stopped, and in the interwar period, the society, affected, among other things, by confiscation of part of the property, focused mainly on the maintenance of the existing condition. One phase of the transformation of the former battlefield into a commemorative site was completed in 1936, when new tourist signs were erected and a new battlefield guide was published. But above all, the construction and opening of the War of 1866 Museum was an important act. These activities also originated from private circles, preferably the Society for Preservation of War Memorials on Hradec Králové battlefield of 1866, one of the heirs of the branched organizational network of the former committee. This committee being dissolved. However, the opening of the museum became the proverbial swan song, as the clouds of the Second World War had also fallen over the preservation of the monument of the memorials on the battlefield in Hradec Králové. The activities of the society did not cease during the early years of the Nazi occupation, although in 1940 the society had to exclude members of non-Aryan origin from its ranks. But the situation worsened after the assassination of the acting Reich protector Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. At that time, like other societies, the society had to curtail its activities. Paradoxically, thanks to this, its representatives were able to prove after the liberation in 1945 that the society as a whole did not collaborate with the Nazis, and on the contrary, excluded collaboration members from its ranks. Nevertheless, in 1951, the Society for the Preservation of War Memorials on the Hradec Králové battlefield of 1866 was forced to close down under pressure from the state authorities. Its leaders, the chairman Dr. Miloš Kafka, the vice chairman, Professor Josef Simon, and the executive director, Professor Otakar Jaroš. Their very title are symptomatic, lost their battle. The society, with its roots in 1888, had to be officially liquidated. The society was then erased from the socialist register and had to surrender all its assets, funds, the museum building, the guardhouse, and the watchtower of Chlum, including equipment, museum collections, and 2 fortress works. Because and I quote from sources, the existence of the society did not help the construction of socialism. The care of the war graves was transferred to the local national committees, and thus any further activity of civil associations and societies independent of the state was found by the state authorities to be without purpose. Thus, during the 1950s, the state took over the care of Austrian-Prussian war memorials from the civic associations through the district monument conservators. In the Hradec Králové region, it was the aforementioned Otakar Jaroš, ironically a former member of the management of the Society for the Preservation of War Memorials on the Hradec Králové battlefield from 1866. In 1966, which was the 100th anniversary of the war, it was forbidden to hold a traditional public commemoration of the victims of this conflict, although an exhibition at Regional Museum of East Bohemia in Hradec Králové eventually took place. In 1954, several enthusiasts founded a local history club at the Zdeněk Nejedlý Museum in Hradec Králové. In the 1960s, the original club became the Club for the Preservation of Memorials and Nature at the Cultural House of the Revolutionary Trade Union Movement in Hradec Králové. Its chairman was the engineer Václav Vlaštovička, who chose a slow but in many cases effective tactic in this fight with state officials and tirelessly addressed complaints about the disrepair of the memorials from the war of 1866 to all possible competent places. This, of course, drew attention to him, but his aura as a member of Svoboda's army and his wartime merits were sufficient protection. Not so for his associates. The club's activities were banned many times. It changed its name and headquarters many times during its existence, and its leaders were investigated and intimidated by the state security. Nevertheless, the club's activities were not liquidated.
Byť tedy výstava v tom roce 1966, kterou pořádal
There was in 1966 anniversary, well, celebrations of anniversary were forbidden. There was, however, an exposition on this topic. The care for the memorials had to pass into a kind of shadow, almost a descent, as to say. Another personality of the Club for the Preservation of Monuments and Nature, whose name should be mentioned in relation to the protection of memorials, is Bohumil Poláček. A plumber by profession, he joined the club in 1969 and immediately became actively involved in the work of recording and documenting the memorials and carrying out minor and major repairs as part of the volunteer brigades, these brigades being unofficial. At the end of 1970s and during the 1980s, members of newly emerging military history clubs from Trutnov, Josefov, Brno, the city of Ostrava, or even Kladno began to appear on the Hradec Králové battlefield. Thus, another specific group crystallized outside the official structures or at their periphery, which kept the awareness of the war events of 1866 alive. Nevertheless, any attempts to commemorate the fallen of the Austrian-Prussian War continued to be banned and even actively suppressed. These unauthorized gatherings were dispersed very often, for example, in 1983 or in 1985. There are many oral recollections of the participants of these gatherings that are available today. In these years, there was also the paradoxical situation that the national security and state security units monitored and sometimes prevented even a simple visit to the museum building in Chlum, even though it was an official cultural monument, in order to prevent the gathering of anti-state elements. This reaction of the state authorities was reinforced by the fact that an unofficial commemorative meeting on the battlefield was covered by Austrian state television in 1982. This is available on the internet as Kaliningrad 116, 1982. A separate chapter is the behavior of the administrator of the Hradec Králové battlefield, Comrade Hrdý, who actively cooperated with the state security in persecuting those interested in military history who visited the monument entrusted to him. Probably the greatest danger posed to the Hradec Králové battlefield between 1951 and 1989 was the intention to build a strategic fuel depot here, right in the heart of the Sweep Forest, the symbolic site of one of the greatest battles of the Hradec Králové battle, and therefore a site with a large number of graves and monuments. However, the plan was opposed by broad social classes, and so the warehouses were eventually built in Cerekvice nad Bystřicí. The originally selected site of the Sweep Forest was to be used as a municipal waste dump for the Hradec Králové district. The waste repository was to be built in a deep ravine below the monument of the 30th Battalion of Field Hunters, in the place of one of the largest concentrations of shaft graves. However, this idea, promoted by the Department of Construction and Urban Planning of the Hradec Králové Regional Council, could not be pushed through. However, the fall of the communist regime at the end of 1989 opened the possibility of restoring the war graves from 1866. So that the war graves could finally be properly cared for after the revolution. Back in November 1989, Miroslav Vytpálek, a local enthusiast and participant in these illegal meetings, came up with the idea of re-establishing the Society for the Preservation of War Memorials on the Hradec Králové battlefield, which would actively take care of the monuments and memorials of the War of 1866. Together with his friends, he initiated a meeting which resulted in a rough sketch of the Futures Association statutes based on the statutes from the time of the founder of the pre-war Hradec Králové committee, centurion Jan Nepomuk-Štaňský, from 1891. Thus, the imaginary circle was ready to be closed. The next step was the publication of a public appeal with the text of founding of the Society for the Preservation of the War Memorials of 1866. Even during 1990s, a question unthinkable before 1989 was discussed, the idea of organizing an official commemorative event for the 124th anniversary of the Battle of Hradec Králové. The renewal of the committee was completed on the 20th of April 1990 with the decision of the Ministry of the Interior of the Czechoslovak Republic to approve the statutes of the association. The 1866 committee was thus able to officially begin its activities, which it has been carrying out throughout the Czech Republic ever since. We, together with my colleague, we are also hoping to develop some other points too in the written form of our contribution. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation, nicely contrasting with that of Čeněk, Pýcha.
Nezájmu, respektive potlačování, vzpomínání na určité události a naopak zase jeho
interest and disinterest in certain historical periods. Meanwhile, the viewers of our conference were quite active. We have about 10 questions and then some comments. I'm afraid we will not have time for the comments, most probably. But the panelists will be able to read the comments on YouTube later because these comments are related to what you said in your presentation. So let me start by the question from Zdislava Pilařová.
Je směřována vlastně na všechny řečníky.
Because it's a question for all panelists, actually. Zdislava Pilařová is asking, in your view, when did the public become more interested in monuments or potential monuments from the second half of the 20th century? I had a similar question in view, actually, especially related to the Vltava Cascade, where preservationists tried to protect or maintain some of the monuments. So, to what extent these experts were lonely in their efforts? Was there any support from the wider public or from some other groups of society, from the locals, for example? But the question is related actually to all the topics we have heard of. So please answer in the same order as your presentation. So Milan, Bárta first.
Vzhledem k mému příspěvku tento dotaz asi není úplně adresován.
I believe this question is not really for me, given the contents of my presentation, but as for the interest of the public in monuments and heritage, I believe that the security forces of the regime began to have a problem with this. For example, sometimes in the late 1960s or early 1970s, in the 1960s, there was a certain freedom and people became more active and engaged, which again changed in the 70s. So the voices of the public were heard more and more loudly. So it was in the early 1970s that this started happening. Thank you. Martin Gaži, if you are asking about when did the public start to react to these huge losses of heritage related to the dams, it's hard to tell from the sources. We can look at fiction, literature, where we can find many complaints, or actually we can find elogies, admiration of the new landscape. But I believe the general approach was resignation. People felt that this is the new era and we can do nothing about it. There was also a sense of nostalgia, which was growing in time.
Možná mohly být i velmi torzovitě dochované.
A source for this could be letters sent to heritage protection institutions from the public. We could find some information there. I have to say I have not found many of such letters for these sites. I found something from the 1960s, 1970s, and mostly these were complaints about the disastrous state of the buildings, of the sites. In Týn nad Vltavou, there was an owner of a historic house from the Middle Ages. The building was very important for the city, and the owner used this argument, and she hoped that with her letter she could change the situation, but the answer was, we have tried as well, but we were not able to do anything about it. Thank you. In relation to the destruction of the old mosque, František Šmahel wrote in 1963, the historian František Šmahel wrote that contrary to the border zones, when dams were constructed in the land, there were protests from the locals. There was the difference between the border zones where there were no protests because people were not settled there, and in other parts of the country people did protest, but you seem to not to confirm this. In Slapy, concerning Slapy, there were mass protests. The other extreme is Lipno. The landscape was exhausted. Oh, sorry, the landscape was empty. There were no people really settled there. There were very few locals. As for Oralík, I have not found any signs of organized resistance. Myself, I'm from the region of Písek, and there people used to cry over the sites. So it was more a sense of resignation. Maybe this is also due to the fact that Slapy was built earlier and people still remember the times before the communist putsch. And in the late 50s, people were also already, people had already given up. I'd like to mention František Schwarzenberg, his memories. There was a mixture of nostalgia, regret, but we can also find an expression of the view that the dams are needed in these times. So there was an acknowledgement of the necessity of this from a person where it could be least expected, from someone from the family of Schwarzenbergs. So thank you. Now I will ask Čeněk about the relationship to people, to the public, to monuments and memorials. You have already mentioned this a little bit, but is there something you would like to add? Thank you very much for the question. I like to underline the status of the new buildings, the modern memorials, in view of the temporality and the development of the relationship to monuments. After the war and in the 1950s, according to my research, these agendas were separated, they were separate. For example, under the Ministry of Culture in 1950, there was an ideological council for memorials and memorial plaques, which really focused on the construction of memorials. And there was not this discourse on monument care. And there was the Monument Act in 1958, and then the National Cultural Monuments in 1962, and that was a breaking point. Like in the case of the Duchcov Viaduct, suddenly the cultural monuments appeared, the memorials that appeared 10, 20 years after the war. There's the Terezín, Lidice, and suddenly the two agendas started converging, and this culminated in 1968 when these newly built buildings or memorials became even more numerous. I'd like to remind the European context. For example, Auschwitz concentration camp was inscribed in the UNESCO list in 1979. So it was a global trend, actually. Thank you very much. Same question for Vojtěch Kessler.
Těch spolků a tak dále, které byly rušeny v 50. letech.
Members of the societies and associations that were dissolved, that were being dissolved throughout the second half of the 20th century. Is it a cross-cutting phenomena throughout the society, or is it something specific? Yes. These monuments and memorials weren't really a cross-cutting subject pertinent for the whole society. So the group of interest was not very large and was very local. So more than a whole society periodization, it is mainly the secondary relationship to the monuments that is important for our work. So it's the year 1966 that is important because it was the centenary and not 1962, for instance. Okay, thank you very much for your answers. I have now two questions from the audience. Questions for Milan Bárta. The first one concerns the case of the theft of two graphics from the National Gallery. So we've got the question, how was this found out about? And a second question, were there any penalization for the workers of the gallery? And another question, was the state security looking for the monuments or works of art that disappeared from the private collections? Yes, let me take the questions one after another. So in the National Gallery, there were different controls, different checks, but as you could have seen on the photos, the works of art, the materials were not really properly ordered. They were just piled up, so it was not easy to find about them. And it was only after the inventorization and catalogization of these materials that the theft was, that they found about the theft. So these were theft, there was no violence used, that is why the criminal police was not involved. And of course, the workers, the perpetrators were punished. And as a result, František Novotný, the director of the National Gallery, resigned from his function, from his managing function. Also, although he was not involved himself, he lost the trustworthiness needed for the managing director post. So there were reactions. The politicians were interested in these cases, and it also led to some impacts also on the works of other galleries and other museums. And could you please remind me of the second question? Yes, the second question was if there were any investigations of disappearing monuments and pieces of art from private collections that were investigated by the national police. Yes, the problem is that there was not a specialized department that would concentrate on this kind of criminality. So you need to look through the records of different departments, different investigation departments, economic crime and others. But these departments, these police departments, existed on local, on regional and on state level. So the research is very complicated. Thank you. And as for the National Gallery case, from a different point of view, you can find some information about it in the new book published by Milana Bartlova, a monography on the history of art after the Second World War. So you can find some information about the political context and about the resignation of the National Gallery director in this book. So this is just to remind you of another piece of work, of another book concentrating on this subject. We've got other questions. We've got questions for Čeněk Pýcha. Vít Jesenský is asking, or it's not a question really, it's a tiny polemics maybe. And he says that according to Regal's categorization, in Regal's categorization, all the monuments are intentional, so Regal is being inaccurate. Can you add something on this subject? Also, there is a question regarding Frivaldov. Are there any other intentions or others than you mentioned? Thank you. Thank you for both questions. As for the Regal comment, I don't consider myself being an expert on Regal or Vienna school, but what I found interesting was the fact that this differentiation of monuments can be found on the very beginning of heritage care. So and there is a difference if we try to protect some value of a past or if we protect a present value. So Regal already sees a continuity in this. As opposed to the approach from 1960s. And as for the Vltava question, there is the question of causing damage. That is clear. And we also can project this to some current discussions, like damages to the statue of Koněv. But in the case of Vltava, oh, it's not Vltava today anymore, it's Lipová Lázně, I'm sorry for that. It's not a real commemoration place, it's more of a intersection of roads. I've heard that young people go there and ride skateboards, so it's very similar to what happened at Letna at a local level. So it's not really, it doesn't really show any relationship to the heritage care. Thank you. And there is another question from Martina Mertová. Do you know the number of the change in status of national monument because of ideological reasons after 1948? For instance, the workers' houses in Olomouc-Hejčín, this set of houses was proclaimed a national monument in 1967. Then, after the revolution in 1989, it remained monument because of the protection of countryside urbanism. So, what do you think about, what can you add on that one? Usually, even if the status of a national cultural monument is taken out of a monument, these buildings usually keep the status of cultural monuments. But according to my research in magazines, I don't think there has been any proper debate on this. Maybe some experts will correct me on this, but I think that this change of status was really on an ad hoc base. But there are cases, I think it's the case of Ploština, where the status was removed and then it was introduced again. And I think that by this we really remove the communist layer from the monument, and afterwards we try to find a new set of values, a new relationship to the monument in question, which can lead to the reintroduction of the status of monument. To state one of the examples, we can state a case of Hrabine Memorial. But I think it really has to do with a change in relationship to the values. Thank you. We've got another question, or maybe another comment. Both of them for Martin Gaži. Vít Jesenský asks, where did you take the information from? Did you go further than libraries and archives? So could you please precise your sources? And comment from Jiří Varhaník, the ruins of the church of St. Nicholas Church in Zvykov Lower Castle was just before the flooding was taken apart for construction material. Have you got anything to add? Yes, for the history of art in 50s and 60s, the most important sources are the oral ones, but today we cannot really use them anymore for clear reasons. And that is why we really should endeavor to record these memories while we still can. And as for other sources, I really must appreciate the work of my predecessors from the Heritage Institute in České Budějovice, because we have a very thoroughly kept archive. Because I know that in other institutes, the records dating back to the times of the National Heritage Institute under communism can't be found anymore, but we still do have these records, including some letters. And also what was interesting was the local perspectives that can be found in different district archives, where we can find documentation by district conservators, and the district of Pýcha in particular has a very vast source base in this regard. And of course, the literature is another source. And as for the Zvykov Lower Castle, there the problem was that it took lots of time before any decision. So there were many hesitations before any decision was taken, and that is why most of the material was taken out for construction purposes. Thank you very much for this answer. We have already run out of time, unfortunately, so I will not mention all the comments that you have put in the chat box on YouTube, but our speakers will read through them thoroughly, I'm sure. But we have a last question to Vojtěch Kessler. How did the construction of the motorway D11 what was its impact on the Hradec Králové battlefield.
I have to say that in 1996, the whole site became a protected site. So the construction of the motorway, D11, involves communication with preservationists. There's archaeological research going underground with the archaeologists from Hradec Králové University, who are also members of the committee, the war committee. So implicitly, within the framework of their work, they make sure that there's a minimal impact on the site by the construction of the motorway. There's also the D36 motorway from Olomouc leading to Hradec, Jičín, and this highway cuts through the battlefield actually. 2 years ago, the construction of gas stations and of a department store was planned on the site, and there were negotiations and
těch obchodech budou prodávat jako propriety v souvislosti nebo v které se vztahují k válce 60.
And there was a suggestion that some souvenirs related to the battle would be sold at the gas station, but later it became clear that there will be no gas stations and no parking lots replacing the heritage site or on the heritage site. That's a nice conclusion. This shows that monuments are a hot topic and that it is being negotiated and that we can reach our objectives and protect the values that are essential to us. I believe that this is a nice conclusion to this very interesting panel discussion. So many thanks to the panelists and also to the audience, to those of you who were active, who sent in the questions. We had a lively discussion in this online format. Many thanks to the organizers, the technical support, the interpreters. Thanks to the interpreters, part of our audience who doesn't speak Czech was also able to listen to us. And now we will have a 30-minute break, and the next panel starts at 11:30, and it will focus on sacral monuments. Goodbye for now.